The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the German heights above Remagen as Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman lifted his field glasses. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, from pure amazement at what he saw below. Through the hazy air of that March afternoon, something impossible stretched across the muddy Rhine waters. A bridge. Still standing, still whole. The date was March 7th, 1945. Every German commander from the Rhine to the distant Elbe River had received the same urgent directive weeks earlier: destroy every crossing before Allied forces could reach them, leave nothing for the enemy, make them pay in blood for every meter of German soil. Yet there it stood in defiance of every military order. The Ludendorff Bridge. Its massive stone towers rose like ancient guardians from the riverbank. Steel girders gleamed in the afternoon light. The structure seemed to mock every assumption the Americans had made about German defensive strategy. 300 meters of Rhine River separated the bridge's western and eastern approaches. Those dark waters represented Germany's final natural barrier against invasion from the west. Swift currents could overturn assault boats in seconds. The depth would swallow entire armored vehicles. Steep banks would trap advancing infantry like fish in a barrel. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman stood beside Engerman. His young voice carried the urgency of the moment. "We have to take it right now, before they blow it to hell." None of them understood what they were witnessing. This single structure would trigger the most complete strategic collapse in German military history, a psychological earthquake that would shatter Nazi defensive doctrine so thoroughly that German officers would later mark this moment as the instant they knew the war was truly lost. The mathematics of warfare were being rewritten in real time, not in soldiers' blood, but in the cold calculations of strategic geometry. The Rhine had never been merely water flowing between banks. It was a fortress 300 meters wide. Currents moved fast enough to flip boats. Depths ran deep enough to drown tanks. Banks rose steep enough to stop entire infantry divisions. Roman legions had first gazed across these waters into Germanic forests 2,000 years earlier. They understood what every military commander since had learned. The Rhine was central Germany's shield against Western invasion. In March 1945, it represented Adolf Hitler's last desperate hope for buying precious time. Time to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. Time to transfer divisions from the collapsing Eastern Front. Time for some miracle that might prevent total defeat. The presence of one intact bridge would destroy that strategic calculation in less than 10 minutes of actual fighting. The stage for this catastrophe had been set months earlier. Hitler's Battle of the Bulge offensive had ended in complete disaster by late January 1945. What German propaganda had trumpeted as a decisive counteroffensive had instead devoured the Wehrmacht's last mobile reserves. 100,000 German casualties lay scattered across Belgian snow. 600 tanks sat as burning hulks in Ardennes forests. Irreplaceable veteran panzer divisions had been ground to nothing. The German armies west of the Rhine now existed as hollow shells of their former strength. By early March, 12 American divisions pressed toward the river along a front stretching from the Netherlands down to Switzerland. The German 15th Army bore responsibility for defending the crucial sector between Cologne and Koblenz. They could muster barely 50,000 combat-effective troops against a force 5 times larger. The bridge itself carried bitter irony that neither side missed. Named after General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's brilliant but ultimately unsuccessful First World War strategist, the structure had been built between 1916 and 1919. Russian prisoners of war had provided most of the labor. Those prisoners, working under brutal conditions that killed thousands, had constructed their bridge too well. Steel trusses could carry the weight of fully loaded military trains. Towers at each end contained 3 stories of defensive positions. 4 massive stone piers sank deep into the Rhine's bedrock. Original specifications had called for demolition chambers built directly into the structure, cavities designed to hold explosives. The bridge could be destroyed before falling into enemy hands. French occupation forces after World War I had filled those cavities with concrete. When Hitler retook the Rhineland in 1936, German engineers had attached 60 zinc-lined boxes to the bridge's girders. Each box was designed to hold 3 kilograms of high explosives. The system was engineered for simultaneous detonation. The entire structure would drop into the Rhine in seconds. But fate and Hitler's paranoia had intervened the previous October. American bombs had struck the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne, detonating its prepositioned demolition charges. The bridge was destroyed before German forces intended it. Hitler's rage had been volcanic. He ordered immediate court-martial of the officers responsible. All demolition charges on Rhine bridges were to be removed immediately and stored nearby. New orders specified that charges could only be replaced when Allied forces came within 8 kilometers. Bridges could only be destroyed by written order from sector commanders. The policy created a nightmare scenario for German officers: blow a bridge too soon and face court-martial for destroying vital retreat routes. Wait too long and face execution for allowing strategic infrastructure to fall into enemy hands. The psychological pressure paralyzed German decision-making at precisely the moment when decisive action was most critical. The American advance toward Remagen had been designated Operation Lumberjack, a modest name for what would become one of the most consequential movements of the entire war. The operation's primary objectives were capturing Cologne and Koblenz, 2 ancient cities controlling vital Rhine crossings. The American First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges drove eastward through the Eifel region. German resistance had degraded from organized defense to desperate delaying actions. German commanders held no illusions about stopping the American advance. Their orders were simple: delay. Buy time for more troops to retreat across the Rhine before the bridges were blown. Major General John Leonard's 9th Armored Division led the American spearhead. They called themselves the Phantom Division because German intelligence repeatedly reported them destroyed, only to encounter them again days later. The morning of March 7th began with thick fog blanketing the Rhine Valley. German command chaos had reached levels that would have seemed impossible in the Wehrmacht of 1940. General Edwin von Rothkirch commanded the 53rd Corps responsible for the Remagen sector. He had accidentally wandered into American lines on March 6th and been captured. His replacement, General Richard von Bottmer, could not reach Remagen because American units had already cut the roads. At 1 in the morning on March 7th, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps was informed that he now bore responsibility for defending the Ludendorff Bridge. He was 64 kilometers away and had never seen the structure. Hitzfeld immediately dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to take command of the bridge defense. Scheller departed at 3 in the morning with 8 men and a radio. He intended to commandeer retreating units to form a defensive perimeter. The journey became a nightmare of wrong turns, American roadblocks, and fuel shortages. The radio unit became separated. Scheller did not arrive at Remagen until 11:15, less than 2 hours before American forces would crest the heights overlooking the town. Captain Willy Bradke, the German commandant actually present at Remagen, commanded a force that existed more on paper than in reality. His official strength was listed as 600 men. The actual combat power consisted of 36 soldiers. Most were either wounded, elderly, or young boys from the Volkssturm militia. Many were Ostgruppen, Soviet prisoners of war who had agreed to serve in German uniform to escape prison camps. Their reliability in combat against Americans was questionable at best. Bratke had spent weeks pleading for reinforcements, for proper radio equipment, for anything that might help him defend a strategic objective that everyone seemed to have forgotten until the Americans appeared on the horizon. His requests disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing command structure. The demolition charges that should have been permanently installed on the bridge were still stored in a nearby building. They awaited orders to be replaced. Those orders finally came on March 6th. Engineer officers scrambled to emplace 2,800 kilograms of explosives in the piers and attach 300 kilograms of shaped charges to critical structural points. The American approach on March 7th had an element of accidental destiny. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman commanded a task force from the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command B, elements from the 14th Tank Battalion, and the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion made up his force. Their orders were to capture the town of Remagen and then turn south to link up with the Third Army. No one expected to find an intact bridge. American intelligence had confirmed that German engineers were systematically destroying every Rhine crossing as Allied forces approached. Photographers had documented the destruction of bridges at Cologne, Bonn, and Koblenz. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen should have been demolished days earlier. When Engerman's lead elements emerged from the woods overlooking the town at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the sight that greeted them seemed almost surreal. German military vehicles were still crossing the bridge. Civilians crowded the approaches. The structure stood intact. Its demolition charges were visible as dark shapes attached to the steelwork. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann would lead the assault, a 22-year-old platoon leader who had been born in Frankfurt, Germany, in 1922. He had emigrated to the United States with his parents as an infant. He spoke fluent German and understood the significance of what they were seeing better than most. The bridge represented something far more valuable than a crossing point. It represented the last barrier's failure, the final natural obstacle overcome not by massive assault, but by a combination of luck and German paralysis. Brigadier General William Hoge commanded Combat Command B. He arrived at the heights at approximately 2:45. He grasped the strategic implications immediately. This was not merely an opportunity to cross the Rhine. This was a chance to vault 3 weeks ahead of Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March. Hoge made the decision that would define his military career. We're taking that bridge. Now. The German defenders were caught in the worst possible tactical situation. Major Scheller had arrived at the bridge approaches just over 2 hours earlier. He was exhausted from his nightmarish journey and stunned by what he found. Captain Bradge briefed him in minutes. The bridge was prepared for demolition with electrical detonators controlled from the eastern tunnel entrance. A backup system consisted of a fuse that could be lit manually. The defensive perimeter was non-existent. Most of the troops Scheller expected to commandeer were already across the bridge or bypassing Remagen entirely. The fog that had blanketed the morning had lifted at precisely the wrong moment. American artillery observers had perfect visibility. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, American tanks appeared at the western approach to the town. The time for deliberation had ended. The assault on Remagen town itself took less than 30 minutes. Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon of M26 Pershing tanks led the advance. The Pershings were the newest and most powerful American tanks in the European theater. They were so new that most German troops had never seen them. Armed with 90mm guns capable of penetrating any German armor, they represented yet another symbol of American industrial supremacy. The tanks fired white phosphorus rounds to create smoke screens. High explosive shells hammered German positions. Remagen's infantry followed, moving through streets that showed the scars of years of Allied bombing. Remagen had been a picturesque Rhine resort town before the war. By March 1945, more than half its buildings had been reduced to rubble. The few German soldiers attempting to defend the town fell back quickly. Most simply fled across the bridge. Captain Bradge watched the American advance from his position near the bridge's western tower. He knew the moment had arrived. At 3:20, he gave the order to blow the western approach ramp. The explosion created a crater 3 meters wide, preventing American tanks from driving directly onto the bridge. but the main structure remained standing. The race for the bridge became a matter of minutes and meters. American tanks positioned themselves at the western end. Their 90mm guns hammered German positions on the eastern heights. The Erpeler Lay, a 180-meter basalt cliff rising on the eastern bank, bristled with German anti-aircraft guns. They now depressed their barrels to fire directly at American troops. Timmerman's infantry, approximately 120 men from A Company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, began moving across the bridge at approximately 3:50. They advanced in short rushes, using the bridge's stone towers and railings for cover. German machine guns opened fire from the eastern towers and from positions in the tunnel mouth beyond. Bullets ricocheted off steel and stone, creating a deadly crossfire. Several Americans fell in the first seconds. The rest kept advancing. Major Scheller watched from the tunnel entrance on the eastern side. He faced the most consequential decision any German officer would make that day. The bridge was loaded with explosives. The electrical detonation system was ready. American troops were halfway across. Every instinct, every principle of military doctrine demanded he blow the bridge immediately. But Lieutenant Karl Peters of the anti-aircraft artillery had approached him minutes earlier with a desperate plea. Peters commanded a battery equipped with the new HS-297 rocket launcher system, a top-secret weapon that fired 24 high-velocity anti-aircraft rockets with unprecedented accuracy. The battery was still on the western side of the bridge. Peters could not allow this advanced technology to fall into American hands. Scheller agreed to wait. The decision would cost him his life. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the combat engineer responsible for the demolition charges, positioned himself at the electrical detonator in the tunnel mouth. When Peters's battery finally cleared the bridge, Friesenhahn received the order from Scheller. At approximately 4 o'clock, with American troops 2/3 of the way across, Friesenhahn turned the key. Nothing happened. The electrical system had failed. A shell had likely cut the wiring earlier. No one would ever determine the exact cause with certainty. Sergeant Alex Drabik, a 34-year-old from Toledo, Ohio, became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine, since Napoleon's armies had crossed in the opposite direction over a century earlier. Behind him, Timmerman and the rest of a company kept coming. Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and his team began systematically cutting every wire they could find. They raced to disconnect the remaining demolition charges before German engineers could activate the backup system. Unteroffizier Anton Faust, a German engineer, volunteered for a desperate mission. He ran from the tunnel, dashed across approximately 100 meters under direct fire, and ignited the backup fuse by hand. The explosion that followed at approximately 4:15 sent shock waves through the structure. The bridge lifted several inches off its foundations, then settled back. Debris filled the air. American soldiers on the bridge were thrown to the deck, but when the smoke cleared, the structure still stood. The main steel arches had been damaged but remained intact. The 6-inch sag in the roadbed was traversable. The bridge held. The race was over. The Americans had won. The immediate aftermath was chaos controlled by training and determination. American combat engineers swarmed onto the bridge, working frantically to remove the remaining demolition charges and repair the damage to the approach ramp. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser's 27th Armored Infantry Battalion began establishing a defensive perimeter on the eastern side. They expanded from the tunnel entrance across the slopes of the Erpeler Lay. German resistance collapsed with stunning rapidity. Lieutenant Bradge and most of his remaining troops took shelter in the 400-meter railroad tunnel that ran beneath the Erpeler Lay. By 5:30 in the evening, Lieutenant Timmerman and his men had secured the tunnel entrance and captured several hundred prisoners. Most of them were relieved that their war was over. Major Scheller made a fatal decision born of desperation. Realizing that the bridge was lost and that he bore formal responsibility for its defense, he commandeered a bicycle and rode east to find his corps headquarters and explain what had happened. He would be arrested 4 days later, court-martialed, and executed by firing squad as a scapegoat for a failure that had dozens of fathers. News of the bridge's capture traveled up the American chain of command with the speed of an electrical current. At approximately 5 o'clock, Brigadier General Hogue radioed his division commander, Major General John Leonard, with words that were terse and miraculous in equal measure. "We got the bridge." Leonard immediately relayed the information to First Army headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was conferring with his staff when the call came through. According to witnesses, Hodges grabbed the telephone so quickly he knocked over his coffee. Within minutes, he was on the line with 12th Army Group Commander General Omar Bradley. Bradley was in a meeting with his operations officer, Major General Harold Bull, when an aide interrupted with an urgent call. "Brad, we've got a bridge," Hodges said, his voice vibrating with excitement. "A bridge? You mean you've got one intact on the Rhine?" Bradley asked, standing up from his desk. "Yep." Leonard nabbed one at Remagen before they could blow it up. Bradley's response became legendary among the American High Command. "Hot dog, Courtney. This will bust him wide open. Are you getting your stuff across?" "Just as fast as we can push it over," Hodges replied. Bradley immediately called Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower at his headquarters in Reims, France. Eisenhower grasped the significance instantly. The capture represented what he later described as one of those rare and fleeting opportunities that occasionally arise in war, and which, if grasped, have incalculable effects on determining future success. Eisenhower's original plan had called for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to make the primary Rhine crossing near Wesel in late March. It would be supported by elaborate airborne operations and massive artillery preparations. The American crossing was supposed to be secondary, smaller in scale, carefully coordinated. The Remagen Bridge changed everything. Eisenhower ordered Bradley to exploit the bridgehead immediately. Every available unit was to be diverted to Remagen. The strategic focus of the entire Western Front shifted south in a matter of hours. The German reaction was a study in command paralysis and murderous scapegoating. When news reached Adolf Hitler at his headquarters in Berlin, his response combined strategic despair with homicidal rage. Hitler had been clinging to increasingly delusional hopes that the Rhine would buy him time to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. The entire German defensive strategy in the West hinged on using the river as a barrier behind which shattered divisions could be reconstituted and redeployed. An intact American bridgehead 3 weeks ahead of schedule demolished that strategy. Hitler's immediate response was to find someone to blame and kill them. He summoned General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, a fanatical Nazi known for his ruthlessness from the Eastern Front. Hübner was given command of a flying special court-martial, with orders to try and execute the officers responsible for losing the bridge. The court-martial would be a legal fiction, a traveling execution squad with judicial pretensions. Hübner was accompanied by 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 military policemen who served as the firing squad. Only one of the officers had legal training. Hübner explicitly rejected offers of copies of the German military code of justice. He declared that the only authority he needed was Hitler's personal order. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic commander of all German forces in the West, was dismissed from his position on March 10th. Hitler's paranoia demanded a scapegoat of appropriate rank. Rundstedt was replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who was hastily transferred from command of German forces in Italy. Kesselring was a capable defensive tactician known as Hitler's firefighter for his ability to stabilize deteriorating situations. But even Kesselring recognized immediately that the situation at Remagen was beyond stabilization. He later described the bridge's loss as the crime of Remagen. It broke the front along the Rhine and made sustained defense impossible. Hermann Göring, commander of the rapidly disintegrating Luftwaffe, was more blunt in his assessment. The capture of the bridge, he said, made a long defense impossible. The psychological impact extended beyond words. German officers who had maintained some hope of holding the Rhine now understood that the war was entering its final phase. The flying court-martial began its work with murderous efficiency. General Major Richard von Bottmer had nominal command of the Bonn and Remagen sector, despite never reaching the bridge. He was tried on March 9th. He was convicted of dereliction of duty, demoted to private, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Von Bottmer's wife was dead. His son had been killed in the war. He grabbed a pistol from a court official and shot himself in the courtroom on March 10th. On March 11th, the court-martial arrived at Field Marshal Model's Army Group B headquarters. 4 officers were tried that day in proceedings that lasted less than an hour each. Major Hans Scheller was convicted of failing to blow the bridge, this despite having arrived only 2 hours before the American attack. Despite having done everything humanly possible under impossible circumstances, Lieutenant Carl Peters was convicted of allowing his secret rocket launcher to fall into American hands. This despite having pleaded for time to get his equipment across. Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Strobel were combat engineers who had laid the original charges days earlier. They were 60 kilometers away when the bridge was captured. They were convicted of insufficient preparation of the demolition system. All 4 men were sentenced to death. The executions were carried out on March 14, 1945, in the forests near the small villages of Rimbach and Oberursel. The 4 officers were led into the woods, forced to kneel, and shot in the back of the neck. They were buried in unmarked shallow graves where they fell. Captain Willy Brage, who had actually commanded the bridge defense and had done more than anyone to prepare its demolition, was tried in absentia and also sentenced to death. But Brage was already an American prisoner, captured in the tunnel on March 7th. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer who had actually attempted to detonate the charges, was also in American custody. Friesenhahn was tried in absentia and acquitted, a rare moment of judicial rationality in the proceedings. Field Marshal Model put his personal stamp of approval on the death sentences. He demanded that every German military unit receive word of these executions. The message carried brutal clarity. Any failure would result in execution. Circumstances meant nothing. The condemned officers faced firing squads while American soldiers streamed across the very bridge they had failed to destroy. The bridge stood damaged but functional. Repair crews worked without rest to strengthen weakened sections. The approach ramp needed immediate attention. Combat engineers from an entire battalion strung lights across the structure. The harsh white glare turned night into day. Country police officers directed the endless flow of men and machinery. Their whistles pierced the air constantly. Traffic moved in both directions without pause. 24 hours after the initial capture, more than 8,000 American troops had crossed onto the eastern bank. The numbers continued climbing hour by hour. Tank companies rumbled across the span. Artillery batteries followed with their heavy guns. Infantry battalions marched in formation. This was the only intact Rhine bridge between Switzerland and the North Sea. Every commander understood the stakes. The bridge could collapse without warning. Combat engineers began constructing backup crossings immediately. Speed was everything. March 9th arrived with the completion of the first tactical bridge. The M1940 aluminum alloy treadway bridge took shape just north of the Ludendorff structure. Workers began a second pontoon bridge before the first was even finished. The sounds of construction never stopped. American planners knew they had to make the bridgehead permanent. The original structure might fail at any moment. But by then it wouldn't matter. Multiple crossings would ensure continued operations regardless of what happened to the captured bridge. Hitler's strategic reserves rushed toward the bridgehead. By March 1945, these reserves consisted of hastily assembled battle groups. Shattered divisions provided what men they could. Rear echelon units were stripped of personnel. The German response was everything they could muster. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of its former power. Yet they launched repeated air attacks against the bridge site. Desperation drove pilots into missions they knew were suicide. The attacks came at all hours of the day and night. American intelligence officers counted each sortie carefully. Over the next 10 days, they recorded 367 separate German air attacks targeting the Remagen area. The numbers revealed the intensity of German desperation. Every available aircraft was thrown into the battle. The American response was massive. 5 complete anti-aircraft battalions moved into position around the bridge. Hundreds of guns created an interlocking field of fire. The defensive box extended for miles in every direction. No aircraft could approach without facing concentrated gunfire. The anti-aircraft battles reached unprecedented intensity. American gunners claimed over 100 German aircraft shot down in 10 days. The sky above Remagen became a killing field. Wreckage from shot-down planes littered the countryside for miles around. German technology reached its peak in these desperate attacks. Arado Ar 234 jet bombers screamed down in diving runs exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. These were the world's first operational jet bombers. Their speed made interception nearly impossible. The jets dove from high altitude with engines screaming. Their bombing runs were spectacular but inaccurate. High speed made precise targeting almost impossible. Most bombs fell harmlessly into the Rhine or exploded in empty fields. The jets were impressive but ineffective. Messerschmitt Me-262. Jet fighters joined the attacks. These aircraft represented German technological innovation at its absolute peak. Nothing the Allies possessed could match their speed. They flashed across the sky like silver bullets. But speed alone could not overcome fundamental problems. Germany possessed too few aircraft. Fuel supplies were critically low. Experienced pilots were even scarcer. Most Me-262s were flown by hastily trained youngsters who had never seen combat. Their missions were brave but futile. Technology could not compensate for numerical inferiority. German air attacks caused casualties and damage, but failed in their primary objective. Neither the original bridge nor the tactical bridges under construction were destroyed. The attacks continued because Hitler had ordered them to continue. Military logic no longer governed German strategy. Hitler personally authorized V-2 rocket attacks against the bridge. This marked the first and only use of these strategic weapons against a tactical target. The decision revealed how desperate the situation had become. Strategic weapons were being wasted on tactical problems. The V-2 was a ballistic missile reaching speeds over 5,000 kilometers per hour. It had been designed to terrorize London, not hit precise military targets. Accuracy was never its strength. The weapon was meant to cause fear, not destroy specific objectives. 11 V-2 rockets were launched at Remagen from sites in the Netherlands. The launch sites were 130 kilometers away. Each rocket followed a ballistic trajectory that peaked above the atmosphere. The rockets killed American soldiers and German civilians in nearby towns. Not one rocket hit the bridge. The weapon simply lacked the precision for such a target. Each launch represented a waste of resources Germany could not afford. The V-2 attacks demonstrated technological capability, but strategic bankruptcy. German commanders sent frogmen down the Rhine River. 7 naval demolition specialists wore Italian-made underwater breathing apparatus. They swam downstream toward the bridge under cover of darkness. Their mission was nearly impossible but had to be attempted. American defenders detected the frogmen using canal defense lights. This secret technology projected intense beams across the water surface. The lights revealed everything moving beneath the surface. Shadows betrayed the swimmers' positions instantly. All 7 frogmen were killed or captured. Their sacrifice accomplished nothing. The American defensive measures proved completely effective. Every German underwater attack failed before reaching the bridge approaches. Explosive-laden boats floated down the river. Mines disguised as logs drifted with the current. German engineers tried every conceivable method of attack. Remote-controlled boats carried massive charges toward the bridge supports. All were detected and destroyed. The Germans deployed the Karlgerät super heavy siege mortar. This 600mm weapon fired shells weighing over 2 tons. The Karlgerät was one of the largest artillery pieces ever constructed. Its shells could demolish any fortification with a single hit. Moving the weapon into position required days of preparation. Railroad cars carried the components to firing positions. Cranes assembled the massive barrel and carriage. The entire process took place under constant air attack. Allied fighters strafed the work crews repeatedly. The weapon's accuracy was severely limited despite its enormous destructive power. The few shells fired at the bridge all missed their target. The massive explosions created spectacular craters but left the bridge untouched. Another German superweapon proved ineffective against a tactical target. The psychological impact of all these failed attacks was opposite to Hitler's intentions. Every unsuccessful assault reinforced American morale while demonstrating German desperation. American soldiers in the bridgehead watched the enemy exhaust himself against their defenses. German soldiers understood they were witnessing the Wehrmacht's death throes. Prisoners captured in bridgehead fighting expressed relief that their war was finally over. Many had expected orders to counterattack the bridge. They knew such orders would be suicide missions. The American presence across the Rhine destroyed whatever hope remained that Germany could avoid total defeat. The strategic calculations were brutally simple and completely clear. With American forces already across in strength, the river had ceased functioning as a defensive barrier. Every German division deployed to contain the Remagen bridgehead was unavailable to defend against massive Allied crossing operations planned for late March. The German defensive front was being pulled apart by forces it could no longer contain. Resources were being consumed faster than they could be replaced. Major General Karl Wagner served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model. Wagner later provided the most concise German assessment of Remagen's strategic impact. The capture of the bridge signaled the end of the war for Germany, Wagner stated during post-war interrogations. The Remagen affair caused tremendous feelings of guilt and shame among the German command structure. It demonstrated that the Allies now possessed complete initiative. German forces could only react defensively. They could never again seize the advantage or dictate the tempo of operations. The failure to destroy the bridge symbolized the complete breakdown of German command and control systems. Orders could not be transmitted effectively. Units could not coordinate their actions. The inability to execute even basic military operations was now apparent to everyone. For German officers trained in the Prussian tradition of military excellence, this failure cut exceptionally deep. It represented more than a tactical defeat. It was a moral collapse of everything they had been taught to value. The Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe in 1940 had disintegrated beyond recognition. The bridge collapsed on March 17th at approximately 3 in the afternoon. The structure had stood for 10 days under conditions no engineer had ever anticipated or planned for. American traffic had been continuous throughout this period. Thousands of vehicles had crossed and recrossed repeatedly. German artillery had scored direct hits and damaging near misses. Air attacks had caused cumulative damage to the structure. Vibrations from nearby explosions had stressed metal that was already fatigued by decades of use and the failed German demolition attempt on March 7th. Witnesses reported hearing rivets popping like gunshots in the minutes before the final collapse. The sounds echoed across the water like a drumbeat. A vertical hangar on the southern arch snapped with a crack that could be heard for miles. Then another hangar failed. The entire center span lifted briefly into the air. For a moment, it seemed to hang suspended above the Rhine. Then it fell into the river with a roar that could be heard for kilometers in every direction. The sound was like thunder that continued for minutes. 28 American combat engineers died in the collapse. Over 60 others were injured, many seriously. Most were members of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion. They had been working on repairs at the exact moment of structural failure. The irony was bitter beyond description. The very men who had saved the bridge through their frantic work to disarm German demolition charges now died because their repairs could not overcome the accumulated damage. Their sacrifice had bought 10 crucial days, but cost them their lives. By the time the bridge fell, it had become strategically irrelevant to continued operations. American combat engineers had completed 2 tactical bridges and were finishing construction on a third. Multiple crossing points now spanned the Rhine at various points near Remagen. Pontoon bridges, treadway bridges, and Bailey bridges provided redundant crossing capabilities. More than 25,000 American troops had crossed the damaged Ludendorff Bridge before its final collapse. After the collapse, the rate of crossing actually increased dramatically. The tactical bridges could handle heavier traffic loads than the damaged original structure. Vehicle columns moved faster across the newer spans. Supply convoys no longer had to worry about structural failure. The bridge's destruction actually improved operational efficiency. March 25th marked 18 days after the bridge's initial capture. By that date, over 125,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. 6 complete divisions with all their tanks, artillery, and supply trains had established themselves east of the river. The bridgehead extended 8 miles deep and 25 miles wide. It included 11 kilometers of the critical Autobahn connecting the Ruhr industrial region with Frankfurt. American forces were positioned to drive deep into central Germany. The breakout was about to begin. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead began on March 25th with explosive force. American armored divisions that had been constrained by the narrow bridgehead perimeter suddenly burst eastward. The confined space that had limited their movement was suddenly gone. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division covered 108 kilometers in a single day. Combat Command advanced 110 kilometers in just 11 hours. These were unprecedented rates of advance for mechanized forces in enemy territory. German resistance that had been fierce in the narrow confines around the bridge evaporated across the wider front. Units that had fought desperately to contain the bridgehead simply disappeared. Entire German formations surrendered rather than face annihilation in open terrain. March 29th brought massive prisoner hauls as German resistance collapsed. Combat Command captured more than 1,200 prisoners in a single engagement. German soldiers emerged from hiding places with white flags. They had been waiting for opportunities to surrender safely. The American advance proceeded so rapidly that German commanders lost track of their own units. Field reports became meaningless within hours of transmission. Radio communications broke down as units moved beyond range. The command structure was dissolving in real time. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B had numbered approximately 325,000 men before the Remagen breakout began. This formation had been among Germany's most effective military organizations. Now it began to disintegrate under the pressure of multiple American offensives. Divisions lost contact with Corps headquarters. Corps lost contact with Army commands. Army commands could not reach Army Group headquarters. The command structure that had held the Wehrmacht together through 5 years of war was finally coming apart. The strategic implications cascaded through the entire German defensive system like dominoes falling. Field Marshal Model found himself commanding an army group that was simultaneously trying to accomplish 3 impossible missions. Each mission alone would have been difficult. The army group was defending against the Remagen bridgehead while containing American forces breaking out from other Rhine crossing sites. It was also trying to prevent complete encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region. All 3 objectives were impossible to achieve with available forces. The Ruhr represented Germany's industrial heart and the source of 80% of its coal and steel production. Model understood that losing the Ruhr meant losing any possibility of continued war production. Without coal and steel, the Wehrmacht could not replace losses. Vehicles could not be fueled, Ammunition could not be manufactured. The industrial base that sustained military operations would simply cease to exist. The loss of the Remagen Bridge had created conditions for the loss of the Ruhr. The loss of the Ruhr meant the end of the war. March 31st marked 3 weeks after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge. By that date, all 4 American armies operating on the Western Front had crossed the Rhine River. The crossing that Allied planners had anticipated would require elaborate amphibious operations had been accomplished with stunning speed. Massive casualties had been expected. Weeks of fighting had been planned for. Instead, the Rhine crossing had proceeded faster than anyone had dared hope. The river that had held Roman legions at bay for centuries had been breached at multiple points in less than a month. The Rhine had served as Germany's western rampart for 2 millennia. Germanic tribes had used it to stop Roman expansion. Medieval kingdoms had fought for control of its crossing points. Modern Germany had planned to make its final stand along its banks. Eisenhower's assessment captured the full magnitude of what had been achieved. "We were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge," he wrote in his memoirs. The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany had been pierced. The final defeat of the enemy was suddenly just around the corner. The American assessment was echoed by observers from other nations around the world. War correspondents declared that the conflict had been shortened by months. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery acknowledged the strategic significance despite his own operation being eclipsed. Montgomery's carefully planned Operation Plunder Rhine Crossing had been overshadowed by the American success at Remagen. His elaborate preparations seemed excessive compared to the simple boldness of seizing an intact bridge. The Americans had accomplished by luck what he had planned through meticulous preparation. Soviet commanders watching the rapid Allied advance from the east accelerated their own operations. They were determined to reach Berlin first regardless of what happened in the west. The race for Germany had become a sprint. The starting gun had been fired at Remagen. German military authorities offered varying assessments of how much the bridge's loss had shortened the war. Some claimed the impact was measured in weeks. Others insisted it was months. Precise calculations were impossible to make. The truth was that strategic effects were systemic rather than linear. The bridge's capture had not merely advanced the Allied timetable. It had fundamentally altered German strategic options in ways that could not be quantified easily. Before Remagen, German commanders could imagine holding the Rhine through April and possibly into May. They could use that time to reinforce defenses around Berlin. They might negotiate with Western allies for a separate peace that would allow concentration against the Soviets. After Remagen, such calculations became pure fantasy. The Rhine had fallen 3 weeks ahead of the original schedule. German reserves that should have defended against Montgomery's northern crossing had been consumed in futile attempts to eliminate the Remagen bridgehead. The psychological impact on German troops was incalculable, but absolutely devastating. Morale collapsed as news of the bridge's capture spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had been told the Rhine was impregnable discovered it had been crossed almost casually. Colonel F. Russell Lyons commanded the 3rd Corps engineers whose men had captured and held the bridge. He estimated that having an intact bridge saved the Allies 2 months of fighting and 35,000 casualties. This calculation was based on comparing Remagen with amphibious operations required at other sites. At Wesel, Montgomery's Operation Plunder required over 1,200 artillery pieces. Elaborate airborne drops were conducted. Substantial casualties were suffered despite overwhelming Allied superiority. At Remagen, American forces had crossed with minimal casualties because the bridge eliminated assault boats. River crossings were most vulnerable during the initial assault phase. Boats loaded with infantry made perfect targets for enemy gunners. The bridge allowed American forces to cross under the protection of their own covering fire. The tactical advantages were enormous. Historian Ken Heckler conducted extensive post-war interviews with participants from both sides. He concluded that the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge materially hastened the ending of the war. Other historians suggested the capture shortened the conflict by approximately 6 months. Variations in estimates reflected different methodologies and assumptions about what might have happened otherwise. But the consensus among serious historians was absolutely clear. Remagen had been a genuine turning point in the war's final phase. The human cost of the bridge's capture and subsequent defense provides another measure of its significance. American casualties in the Battle of Remagen and fighting in the bridgehead totaled approximately 860 killed. Nearly 5,700 were wounded. An approximately equal number were listed as missing in action. These were heavy losses concentrated in just 18 days of fighting, from March 7th to March 25th. The casualty figures reflected the intensity of German attempts to eliminate the bridgehead. German casualties in the same period exceeded 11,700 prisoners alone. Killed and wounded numbers were never accurately tallied, but certainly exceeded 10,000. The disparity reflected the fundamental imbalance of forces that characterized this phase of the war. The Americans possessed air superiority, artillery superiority, and armored superiority. They held the psychological advantage of knowing they were winning the war. German soldiers had orders to counterattack that they could not fulfill with available resources. Equipment was breaking down faster than it could be repaired or replaced. Fuel shortages limited movement. Ammunition was rationed. Most importantly, there was the growing certainty among German soldiers that the war was already lost. The executions of German officers held responsible for losing the bridge cast a dark shadow over the military's traditional honor code. Major Hans Scheller had been a 31-year-old career officer. He had served with distinction on both the Eastern and Western fronts. Scheller was married with young children he would never see grow up. His crime had been arriving at the bridge just 2 hours before its capture. He had failed to perform a miracle with 36 exhausted soldiers against several thousand Americans supported by tanks and artillery. Lieutenant Carl Peters had been a technical specialist trying to save secret equipment from capture. His execution occurred despite testimony that he had acted in complete accordance with standing orders to preserve advanced technology from enemy hands. Majors Kraft and Strobel had been following standard procedures for preparing demolition charges. They had worked with the materials and equipment available to them. Their preparations had been technically correct according to established engineering protocols. None of the 4 condemned men deserved death. All 4 were scapegoats for a system that had collapsed from the very top. Their executions served no military purpose. They were killed to satisfy Hitler's rage at a situation beyond anyone's control. After the war, General Hubert Rudolf Hubner faced justice for conducting the flying court-martial. He was tried by German courts and sentenced to 4 years in prison for his role in the illegal executions. The sentence was modest for what amounted to judicial murder, but it established an important principle. Even in Germany's darkest hour, some officers had recognized that the trials were a complete travesty of justice. The post-war prosecutions sent a message that illegal orders were not a defense for war crimes. The final assessment of Remagen's significance must include its role in Allied strategic debates about ending the war. Before Remagen, there had been serious discussion about halting at the Rhine. Some argued for allowing the Soviets to bear the brunt of the final assault on Germany. British and American planners worried that crossing the Rhine would prove costly. Soviet forces attacking from the east could accomplish the same objective with less Western loss of life. The debate reflected legitimate concerns about casualty levels in the war's final phase. Remagen made that entire debate completely moot. With American forces already across the Rhine and expanding their bridgehead daily, halting made no strategic sense whatsoever. The momentum had to be maintained regardless of other considerations. The rapid advance from the Rhine to the Elbe River vindicated that decision completely. The advance was accomplished in just over 1 month. American forces met Soviet forces at Torgau on April 25th, cutting Germany in two. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. The bridge's capture had reverberations far beyond the immediate military situation. In the United States, news of the capture reached the Senate while in session. The leadership suspended rules against applause. Senators stood and cheered spontaneously. Newspapers across America ran headlines declaring that the end of the war in Europe was finally in sight. War bond sales surged as Americans sensed victory approaching. The psychological impact on American public morale was substantial and measurable. After years of war and tens of thousands of casualties, victory was finally tangible and near. Families with sons in Europe dared to hope they might come home soon. The bridge represented more than a tactical success. It symbolized approaching peace. In Germany, news of the bridge's loss spread through military and civilian populations with demoralizing effect. Citizens had been told by propaganda that the Rhine was absolutely impregnable. The Allies would shatter themselves against its defenses. The discovery that the Rhine had been crossed almost casually destroyed what little faith remained in the regime's competence. A single bridge had remained intact through a combination of American luck and German dysfunction. The revelation was devastating to remaining morale. The physical remains of the Ludendorff Bridge tell their own story about war and peace. After the conflict ended, the structure was not rebuilt. The twisted steel and broken stone were cleared from the Rhine for navigation purposes. The towers on both banks remained standing as monuments to the events that had occurred there. The western towers were eventually converted into a peace museum. The Friedensmuseum Brücke von Remagen now occupies the site where the battle began. The museum's exhibits trace the bridge's complete history from its construction through its destruction. Special attention is paid to the March 1945 battle and its far-reaching consequences. Visitors can see artifacts from both American and German participants. The eastern towers on the Erpel side now serve as a performing arts space. The contrast between their wartime and peacetime uses is entirely deliberate. It represents a statement that destruction can give way to creation and hatred to reconciliation. The soldiers who captured the bridge received recognition that matched their extraordinary achievement. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor under fire. His leadership had been exemplary throughout the action. Sergeant Alex Drabik received the same decoration for his role in the assault. Dozens of other soldiers from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and 14th Tank Battalion received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars. Their courage had made the victory possible. Brigadier General William Hogue was promoted and received command of an entire corps. The 9th Armored Division received a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Remagen. These awards recognized individual and collective bravery under the most demanding circumstances, but decorations could not capture the full significance of what had been accomplished that day. The men who crossed the bridge under fire had not merely secured a tactical objective. They had participated in a moment that fundamentally changed the war's trajectory. Every day the war was shortened meant thousands of lives saved, both military and civilian. The soldiers who fought at Remagen contributed directly to that outcome. Their courage had strategic consequences they could never have anticipated. The Remagen story raises profound questions about the role of chance in shaping history. What if the fog had not lifted when it did? Would American scouts have seen the bridge before German engineers could destroy it? What if the electrical detonation system had functioned properly? Would the bridge have been destroyed with American troops actually on it? These questions suggest alternative histories where everything might have been different. What if Major Scheller had arrived 2 hours earlier? Would he have had sufficient time to organize a defense that could have delayed the Americans long enough for demolition? What if Hitler had not ordered the removal of explosives after the Cologne incident? Each of these questions points toward a different outcome. a history in which the bridge was successfully destroyed, a timeline in which the Rhine crossing proceeded according to the original Allied schedule. The accumulation of contingencies that led to the bridge's capture was remarkable. The sequence of events suggests that history is not entirely deterministic. Individual decisions and random occurrences can produce consequences far beyond what anyone anticipated at the time. Small actions can have enormous results under the right circumstances. The final assessment must return to the fundamentally human dimension of these events. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was accomplished by individual men acting under conditions of extraordinary stress and mortal danger. Lieutenant Timmerman led his company across a bridge that might explode at any moment beneath their feet. Sergeant Drabeck sprinted toward the eastern bank while German machine guns fired directly at him. Every step might have been his last. Combat engineers worked under constant fire to disarm demolition charges they had never seen before. Tank crews provided covering fire from positions on the western bank. Staff officers recognized the opportunity and made split-second decisions to exploit it. Commanders redirected entire armies to take advantage of the breakthrough. Each person in this chain of events made individual choices that contributed to the final outcome. Remove any single link, and the result might have been entirely different. This recognition of individual agency within larger historical forces is what makes the story genuinely compelling. The men at Remagen were not simply pawns of historical inevitability. They were active participants who shaped events through their personal courage and critical decisions. The 80th anniversary of the bridge's capture in March 2025 was marked by ceremonies in both Remagen and the United States. Veterans organizations participated alongside historical societies. Military units that trace their lineage to the 9th Armored Division sent representatives. The German government acknowledged the battle's historical significance while emphasizing lessons about the ultimate costs of war and the enduring value of peace. The commemorations reflected the complex legacy that surrounds these events. For Americans, Remagen represents a moment of triumph and a validation of courage under fire. For Germans, it serves as a reminder of defeat but also of liberation from the Nazi regime. For historians, it provides a case study in how contingency and determinism interact in warfare. For all participants and observers, it offers a reminder that individual decisions made in moments of crisis can fundamentally shape the course of human history. The consequences of courage extend far beyond the immediate moment of action. The men who captured the bridge at Remagen could not have known their actions would become the subject of countless books, films, and academic studies. They were soldiers performing their duty in circumstances none of them would have freely chosen. That their duty led to outcomes of genuine world historical significance stands as a testament to the fundamentally unpredictable nature of warfare. It also demonstrates the enduring importance of individual courage when history reaches its crucial turning points.